Okay, this is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. So we're at the beginning of chapter 10, which is the additional chapter or sort of postscript added on to the second edition in 1967. So the first edition, I believe, was 1958. And so obviously there's been a lot of development in this field or related field, cybernetics, computers, and so on, information theory over 9 years. This is like you have like the U.S. space program, for example, is developing all kinds of computer technology at this time. So this is a sort of important period for these types of fields, cybernetics and computers and information theory. So maybe just to sort of quickly recap a little bit of what we looked at last week before we jump into the next part. So he sort of like presented the sort of general framework of the general sort of conceptual framework of his approach to novelty or the appearance of something that seems to be a new phenomenon, a new structure, whatever exactly it is. This has to do with this sort of duality in his approach between true forms and aggregates. So on the side of true forms, we can think of, for example, a living organism, including a human being, but also within those organisms, a cell is a true form. And then an atom or an electron that makes up those cells, those are also true forms. So each of these entities is a true form means that it is a form in a sense for itself. It sort of acts in such a way that it has a sort of self-contained unity, which doesn't mean, of course, that it doesn't interact with the rest of the world, but it's still like the cell sort of treats itself as a unit in the sense that it has a boundary, the cell membrane. It sort of allows certain things to enter, to pass through that membrane, and certain other things not to pass through the membrane. It sort of delimits itself from the rest of the world, even if it does interact with the rest of the world in particular ways. It's sort of like selecting what kinds of interactions it will engage in. And this is true also, of course, of a multicellular organism like a human being. Humans, take in air and food from the surrounding environment and so on, but are selecting what aspects of the environment to allow to incorporate. And then, of course, there are aggregates. So the sort of like stereotypical example would be just a pile of sand. So for any one grain of sand in that pile, there's nothing about being in that pile that sort of connects it to any other grain of sand. It has mechanical interactions with the surrounding grains that they push against each other, but like a grain of sand on one pile, on one side of the pile, and another grain of sand on the opposite side have no direct interaction with each other, and it doesn't make any difference to either of those grains of sand that they are part of the same pile. And of course, there's many other types of aggregates, and so he's talked in previous chapters about like pipes, or in general some sort of mechanism that takes something like an aggregate and makes it and limits the kinds of behavior that they can exhibit. So if you have a pile of sand and you pour it into an hourglass, for example, it will flow at a certain rate, a predictable rate, and then you can use that to measure time. So of course, without the mechanism of the hourglass, the pile of sand would not flow at all. Or if you were to, have something similar to an hourglass, except that it didn't have the narrow sort of pipe between the upper chamber and the lower chamber, it would just all flow. It would just all fall from the top to the bottom immediately. So the sort of setup of the hourglass confines the behavior of the pile of sand, makes it do something that it would be very unlikely to do otherwise. Is sort of out of all the possible behaviors, it makes only a small set of those behaviors possible. And this is what his sort of like general framework for understanding what a mechanism is. So a mechanism always has to do with these aggregates. Something like a pile of sand that doesn't have its own sort of intrinsic reality, intrinsic form, and a mechanism sort of guides the behavior of this aggregate into a small region of its whole space of possible behaviors that it would have without that mechanism. And for Ruyer, these true forms um, are primary, are more fundamental than the aggregates or the mechanisms that guide their behavior. So you have, in the case of, if we go back to the cell in an organism, um, a cell, of course, is made up of many different types of molecules, and it involves, some of these kinds of aggregates. It takes in certain molecules, and it prevents other types of molecules from passing through the membrane, and so you have these like little mechanisms, these sort of cellular mechanisms, uh, like molecular pumps in the membrane that pump certain ions across the boundary. Or you have like sort of lock and key type mechanisms where if a certain protein gets sort of lodged in a certain gate in the membrane, then it makes the gate open and allow certain molecules to pass. Yeah, there's extremely intricate and fascinating sort of micro machines in that make up the structure of a cell. So all these machines are sort of subordinate to the true form, which is the cell as a whole. So it's not just like a cell is not just a certain like jumble of these little machines that just happens to sort of get joined together. The cell, actively produces itself in such a way that it has these machines that ensure that it continues to be able to produce itself. It's a kind of like self-building uh, system of machines rather than just a sort of assortment and an aggregate of machines. And so this is sort of like the key difference where like a sort of I don't think Ruyer uses this example, but something that has sort of come up in like evolutionary biology sort of context is like if you have a junkyard full of like spare parts of an airplane, those spare parts are never going to just sort of spontaneously assemble themselves into an airplane that is like functional and capable of flying and so on. The form, the whole structure of the airplane, the parts only end up being assembled into that airplane if there's deliberate human action to put the parts in the right place and connect them in the right way and so on. It's the same thing for the cell, except of course in the case of the cell, it's not an external entity, a human worker that is putting all the machines in the right place. It's the cell has this sort of internal self self construction capacity in the sense that it sort of makes itself into these machines that serve to keep the cell functioning for further self construction. It's a kind of like recursive self construction process that goes on as long as the cell is alive. Yeah, and so the big question here is like, what is the relationship between these aggregates and these true forms? And yeah, and so we have, I think, last time we talked about there's some, I think, doubts about like how exactly Ruyer kind of solves this problem. In the sense that it does seem like there's still it's not entirely clear. For example, a multicellular organism like a human being is made up of many mechanisms. If you think about like the way a leg functions or any other limb, it's clearly a lever in some respect. It has like a hinge and then a long rigid portion. So there's this mechanical nature of a limb, or like many other joints. So a human body is made up of or contains many machines, among other things. But how exactly you get the sort of true form of the human organism to sort of create these machines is not entirely clear, I think, from Ruyer's presentation. Yeah, so this is sort of like the general framework that he's presenting, is that the true forms are always primary. It's the framing element, and then the mechanisms that guide the behavior of aggregates are framed by the true form. So in the case of humans, of course, it's always some sort of intention of a conscious human being is always primary, and he sort of repeatedly does this kind of exercise in the case of these machines, like in the normal sense of the word, these machines built by humans. Of course, someone at some point has decided I'm going to build this machine, and assembled the parts in a certain way, and when you ordered materials and whatever. There's always a human intention behind these machines, even the ones that are seemingly sort of autonomous. The mechanical tortoise and these types of things that we looked at. This sort of pseudo autonomous behavior of the machine is itself something that is a result of a human decision to build a machine that can exhibit this kind of behavior. And so this is kind of like the general pattern that he's insisting on, is that the true form is always primary and brings about the structuring of these machines that that we observe after that sort of framing operation. Okay, so that's like a very sort of high level summary of a lot of the arguments in the first edition of the book. So yeah, we can move on to the additional chapter in the second edition now.
Okay, chapter 10, The Problems of Cybernetics in 1967, subheading Cybernetics and Informatics. One might observe that the word quote-unquote cybernetics has been less used over the last 10 years. This is certainly not because the object of cybernetics, the techniques and the theory of information, has revealed itself to be illusory or lacking true unity. The physics, biology, psychology, and sociology of information, along with their adjacent techniques, and the general study of communications and languages continue to develop. But this very development is such that the specialists feel less of a need to resort to it. The word quote-unquote informatics would perhaps be more suitable, but it also lost coherence due to excessive development. It designates, sometimes exclusively, the computer's techniques of processing large amounts of information, and it also continues, along with the word cybernetics, to designate the general theory of information. Large computers are not cybernetic machines in the strict sense of the word. They are not purposive feedback machines. They present some quote-unquote digested information to the manager who desires to be in. They play the role of a secretariat that the management asks, quote, give me a report on the employees based on their salaries or seniority. They allow for a well-informed decision that takes into account multiple factors that are difficult to consider at once. The computer can also replace mental experiments. The manager can try out on the computer what the effect of some such decision would, especially if the computers are coupled with some analog calculators for operational research or quote-unquote optimization in general. A surprising effect of computers is that the departments of the firm that has decided to make this expensive purchase must reorganize their whole business to accommodate the. They also sometimes find that the prefabricated circuits of hardware are partly useless and even detrimental to this reorganization. They may even find out that if they had carried out this reorganization first, they could have done without the expense of the machine. The modest performance of large computers, even when coupled with analog calculators, seem not to add up with the public's persisting belief that they have a role to play in political decisions. At the Geneva Summit in 1965, even highly educated people eagerly questioned the Polish-American mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, who was supposed to be in the know about the role of decision-making machines in the Vietnam War. While evidently false, upon reflection, this belief is not absurd. A head of state would make better decisions if there was a way for him to be perfectly informed, with or without quote-unquote informatics. But no machine will ever go searching for truly essential information by itself if we have not supplied it with its quote-unquote input. Assuming it had only quote-unquote digested equipment reports, a computer could very well have answered, like the French Minister of War to the Chamber in 1870, that, quote, no button was missing from the Army's gaiters. Yeah, so this is, to me, this is one of those sections that, one of the points that, even though the technology he's discussing is obviously very outdated, I think the argument that he's making here still holds for Lems. For instance, the idea that the large computer just kind of digests information for a manager, anyone who wants to be informed as to some subject matter or state of affairs, but that of course it won't. ChatGPT isn't going to go out and start learning things on its own, just sort of out of pure interest or a desire to learn something because it needs to know it to survive, or it's still as he says, won't go searching for essential information, just sort of more or less lossily synthesize information when given kind of a command to do so.
Yeah, yeah, I had exactly the same thought as reading, as you were reading this. Yeah, you can basically just like, translate a couple of the sort of outdated terms into, modern terms and just write this exact passage today about this sort of AI, wave in, many of these businesses are, dedicating, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to, incorporating these, AI tools um, into their operations. And there's been several reports in like business press where a lot of these companies are finding that actually they're not really getting a lot out of their investments in AI. That they spent all this money and not seeing a lot of return on that. There are certain domains where it does seem to be helpful. I think like computer programming is one where it is pretty effective. Probably because in part the computer code is itself very structured and in that sense predictable. Like you can't just do anything. You have to follow certain syntax. So that makes it obviously much easier to produce something that is structured in a certain way. But there's still limits to that as well. Like there's the code that it produces is often not that secure. It includes like some security vulnerabilities that a human programmer with like moderate experience would recognize are not a good idea to use. But sort of the more like general purpose use of these technologies tends to be like the what you get from when you ask ChatGPT to generate something for you is like not very good, and then the time you spend like fixing it is like you could have just written it yourself in that time and skipped the whole ChatGPT step. Um, and yeah, I think this bit about like the missing information I think is important because like one of the sort of probably the key problem that has come up with these tools is this hallucination problem where if you ask ChatGPT to tell you something, some piece of information or whatever, and it doesn't have access to that information, it will just invent something that seems more or less plausible, often not particularly plausible to a human, but sometimes it's just plausible enough that the person copy pastes it into like there's been several instances now of legal cases where someone submits a brief that contains these references that actually are cases that don't exist because they just like entered into ChatGPT, write me a brief arguing for X, and ChatGPT inserts these like what looked like references to legal cases, and then the lawyer just doesn't even bother checking if these actually exist, and it turns out they don't. So yeah, here ChatGPT doesn't have any sort of representation of what a legal case is. It doesn't sort of search through a database of legal cases to find what case. It doesn't look at the case and read it and go, okay, this case is relevant to the argument that I'm preparing or whatever. It just like generates a text that looks like a legal brief, and it finds that legal briefs have these like names in parentheses, so it just inserts some names in parentheses that look like a reference to a case. um, so yeah, in this case a human, like even a sort of moderately like just like a I don't know, a junior lawyer or like a paralegal or whatever doing this research would go, I don't actually know if there is a case that makes the point that I'm trying to make here, or that is relevant to this case, and then I guess I should do some more research and find this case. I mean, not to say that humans don't sometimes just make things up or try to cheat or whatever, but it doesn't take like a sort of like deep insight into legal theory to realize that okay, I don't actually know what cases to cite here to support my argument. Whereas in the case of ChatGPT, the fact that it doesn't have access to a case that supports its argument is just not even like a problem for it. It just cheerfully invents a case that it thinks is needed to insert at this point to make it look like a well supported legal argument. Yeah, and so like yeah, in the case of this like military example that Ruyer gives here, so of course 1870 was the just before the Franco-Prussian War, where France was like very easily defeated by Prussia. So here you have the Minister of War saying, everything is like perfectly organized. We have, our army is so well equipped, etc. And then they lose within a couple of weeks, I think, to Prussia, not long after that. So in this case, I mean, I don't know the details, but there was probably a lot of sort of wishful thinking of where like the junior officers are sort of reporting up the chain of command, what they think the superior officers want to hear, rather than giving honest reports, honest assessments of how prepared their units were. And So in this case, of course, there was no ChatGPT involved in the assessment, but the upper level, the senior officers should have looked at these reports and said, this maybe is like a bit too good to be true. I should like do a little bit more digging and investigation into how well prepared this unit really is. But of course, ChatGPT is never going to, if you were to set up ChatGPT as your sort of military preparedness evaluation system, which is a very bad idea. If you were to do that, it would never look at these reports and go, "Oh, this one, it seemed this is all too good to be true. We should investigate more and like check up on these units." It would just take in what you give it and present some sort of more or less plausible summary of all these reports. Uh, so yeah, this sort of exact mechanism of like just taking in the information and not asking any questions is like exactly how these systems work, and why they often produce these very bad results that even like a sort of moderately well-informed person working in this field would identify immediately as not plausible. And I think this bit also about the sort of reorganization of the organization, where you have like a company, decides to like at this time in the 1960s, buying a computer was like a substantial investment. You can sort of compare it today to deciding you're going to incorporate AI into all your operations for whatever reason. So you're spending, you're making a significant investment in this new technological system, but then of course you have to arrange your organization in such a way that you are, for example, producing reports that you can feed into this new information technology, and then taking whatever that system outputs and implementing some sort of response to that information. And Yeah, so in some cases, like just doing that reorganization itself is like whatever benefits you get from the information technology could have been achieved just by reorganizing, producing the reports and looking at the reports with a human eye and just saying, oh, okay, here's what makes sense to do based on this information. So yeah, in some cases, collecting more information or sending information from different teams within the organization back to one central source that would examine them, like that in itself might be useful. And then the actual machine that is sort of collating these reports is not really doing much. So yeah, in some cases, the problem that you're sort of solving by buying this expensive piece of technology is really sort of an organizational problem of not having the information being disseminated in the right way within the organization, and yeah, the actual technology that is producing this report is not really adding anything beyond just sort of solving the organizational problem of not communicating well within the organization. Which is not to say, of course, that it's never useful to you know uh, incorporate some of these technologies into an organization. That I'm sure there are many examples where some sort of I don't know, if you're thinking of like, say, I don't know, Walmart, for example, this organization, hundreds of stores, probably thousands of stores around the world. Of course, it would be impossible to do like some sort of aggregate statistics about like Mozor inventory or whatever, just as a person, like looking at the different reports that each store is sending back to headquarters. You need to have some sort of like, mechanical or electronic calculation of these aggregate statistics. Yeah, so like in many cases, it is of course very useful to, or even essential to, rely on information technology to, perform certain calculations to, and these are quite simple, just adding up the different, the sales from each of the stores. But like I know Walmart, this is sort of like their um, their sort of technique that allowed them to sort of dominate the market for a long time before Amazon came along, was doing all kinds of predictive analysis of sales of different products, where like, so instead of whereas other sort of department stores would have these like big warehouses where they would keep a sort of stock of products, and then based on orders of the different stores would ship them out. Walmart would rely on this sort of predictive process. Like their sort of slogan was like their warehouse was just the trucks that were sort of shipping things around everywhere. And so like you would have these sort of very complicated predictive analyses saying like, given what time of year it is and the weather and I don't know, the labor market conditions or whatever, all these different factors would all feed in. Therefore, given these factors, the sales of rubber boots in this store will be, X next week. And so we need to ship the X amount of boots to the store, things like that. Taking in all this information and sort of predicting what the sales of a given product will be in the next week or the next month or whatever. And of course, it would be impossible, again, for like a human or even like probably a team of humans to sort of, for all the thousands of products that they're selling and all the thousands of different stores and all the thousands of different factors that could affect the sales of each of these products, taking in all this information and producing like a comprehensible sort of prediction of what the sales are going to be and how much of this product needs to be shipped to that store this week. So yeah, like all these very complicated calculations, like to try to get like a team of humans to do this by hand would be like exorbitantly expensive and take probably like the lifespan of the universe or something absurd like that. Okay, so yeah, we can go on to the next bit. Okay, I can read this one. Okay, toys. The cybernetic toys, whose archetypes are Grey Walter's quote-unquote tortoise and Ashby's homeostat, perfected by Dr. Sauvant to become the multistat, seem a little passé today. Assemblies, montage, for specific purposes such as perception, reading, learning, and so forth are usually preferred. The cyberneticians have finally realized that in the industrial machines made purposive via feedback, the purposiveness is double or comes in two stages. First, there is the quote-unquote production of the machine itself, which is its primary end, its main line of material flow. And there is, on the other hand, the flow of information in service of the line of production, which operates in reverse to it. A boiler is designed to heat up with or without a thermostat. The feedback does not then, quote unquote, give purpose to, quote unquote, finalize the machine, properly speaking, as the cyberneticians repeatedly said. Every industrial machine has already been given a purpose by the conscious human being who invented it in terms of its main line of production and its output. The added feedback guides and improves the productivity of the primary purpose. But without this primary purpose, there would be nothing to guide, improve, or control. However, a mechanical toy, unlike an industrial machine, has no primary purpose, finalité, does not extend and serve the primary purpose of humans. The toy is useless. It is only meant to amuse by its movements and pirouettes without these movements being productive. Japanese industry, for example, has made a box that is a kind of quote-unquote pure toy. When it is opened, an articulated hand comes out and closes the lid again. That is all. I love that. In the same way, we can make toys that are only feedback mechanisms. Their motive is only to feed on this feedback itself. A toy steam engine does not activate anything other than the safety valve and the regulator. In a simplified form, Grey Walter's quote-unquote tortoises immediately have great success as toys. They do not do anything, but they do it quote-unquote with care and, it seems, quote-unquote intelligently. Ashby's homeostat and Dr. Sauvant's multistat do not do anything either. They are only feedback systems connected and controlling each other. Without a primary purpose, their secondary purpose means nothing. Okay, I'm going to go through the next section here too. Teaching machines. Pedagogy is what has been most directly affected by cybernetics over the last several years. Cybernetic pedagogy has been the object of a real passion, especially in progressive circles. Predictions about the future, quote, knowledge industry, unquote, are sometimes quite delusional. Teaching by machines or programmed teaching comes straight from, quote unquote, Skinner's box. But if Skinner is the father, Pavlov is the grandfather. In Skinner's box, designed for instrumental conditioning, the rat understands by itself that by pressing on a pedal, it will make a food pellet drop. The rats benefited from a scientific pedagogy before people did. We will remark, 1, that the rat in the box is very, quote unquote, demanding. It is hungry. 2, It is the only living and conscious being. It must find the petal as a means of getting food by itself. 3. The instructor, Skinner, has disappeared. His role is materialized in the arrangement of his box, and this role consists in presenting a well-defined problem to the well-behaved rat to find the petal and its function. 4. The rat, after success, is not only, quote, informed that, unquote, there is a petal. Instead, the rat is equipped with a knowledge which is more permanent and in all likelihood corresponds to a setup in his nervous system. The petal is something, quote unquote, to press in order to get food. To grasp the essentials of cybernetic pedagogy, it suffices to replace the rat by the student wanting to learn spelling, a foreign language, or basic algebra, and to replace the Skinner box with the machine presenting a programmed and progressive problem, and bringing the possibility of learning a succession of basic knowledge elements. For example, the student who learns English is sensorially, quote unquote, informed by a series of pictures and a series of words seen and heard. He must then complete a phrase with a word missing, blank, dog, man, cat, book, blank, on a rug, by a good choice of word petals, and he can only continue if he finds the right one. The reward here is the success itself. Cybernetic pedagogy reverses the schema of so-called traditional pedagogy, in which the teacher is active and the student passive, in which the teacher speaks, transmitting information, while the student listens. This goes for the teaching of the Quran, the lectures courses at the universities, and also teaching over the radio, which proves, by the way, that it is not sufficient to have a machine, even one for quote-unquote audiovisual information, to be included in cybernetic pedagogy. In cybernetic pedagogy, on the contrary, it is the student who plays the active role. He seeks the right way, the right tool. The teacher, or rather his programmed machine, only disciplines the effort. The student is informed of success by feedback, and as a result, according to the psychological laws of learning, he memorizes the right way and can, in this way, progressively establish himself a quote-unquote internal informational chain. The teacher is so passive that after having spent a lot of time programming his teaching, once in class, he can have the impression of wasting his time because he does nothing more than supervise the activity of the students. The student must be strongly motivated not by an instinct like an animal, but by a quote-unquote ideal. It is the condition sine qua non, which is completely opposite to the mechanical toys made for quote-unquote learning. He must invent the right solution at every moment in a sort of vicious circle that is always overcome and in which he fills a quote-unquote blank by informing himself. Even at the most basic level of learning a language or a manual job, there is no training but self-training, which is very different. Although all training supposes a minimum of self-training, that is, of little initiatives by the student. There is a controlled autodidacticism, a mental creation, a controlled but spontaneous mental embryology. Despite its apparently mechanistic character, cybernetic pedagogy is the antithesis of mere training. But if it simplifies the student's work too much, it actually goes back to a quasi-training, as mechanical as the reciting of the Quran or catechism in the old times. In the education of young people and adults, there comes a moment when it is necessary to give them the time to succeed by themselves, not in a succession of tests coordinated by the instructor, but through the completion of their own, quote, little work, unquote. Yeah, this is another one of these sections that, just with some updated terminology could be written today, because this is like, he's basically invented Duolingo, like, I don't know, 60 years in advance. So yeah, this like, what he's describing here as cybernetic pedagogy, this like sort of gamification of teaching, where the whole sort of teaching process is broken down into these micro tasks, and then you get a little reward for each task. And this is how you sort of develop, like, language learning is sort of like the maybe the most applicable case for this kind of teaching style, because of course language learning involves a large amount of memorization. You just have to learn, what is the word for X in the language I'm learning, what gender or what other grammatical categories apply to this word, and so on. Like, you just have to memorize a bunch of stuff. And so this kind of like very sort of micro reward structure is quite applicable to language learning, where if you just insert the right word in the sentence, then you get a little star or whatever. But it also, I think a lot of people have sort of maybe been disappointed with that sort of style of learning, that Duolingo. Like, you can go through Duolingo sort of lessons for months or years in a language, but if that's all you do, you probably are not going to be that capable in that language. Like, if you're sort of thrown into a circumstance that doesn't sort of fit the set of lessons that you've already worked on, if you are sort of picking up a newspaper or trying to have a conversation in that language, yeah, you're probably not going to do that well just from having done these lessons for a year or two. And so part of this is precisely that sort of creativity aspect that this is like something that Chomsky always insisted on, is the fact that most sentences that you are going to read or hear or say or whatever in a language have never been spoken or written before. That there are, of course, sort of stock formulas that you usually say, hi, how are you, whatever, that are used every day. But like a large proportion of the sentences that you say on any given day have never been said before. And so there's this sort of creativity aspect of language, that you're creating something new every time you speak. And so if your whole training in a language is just sort of like filling in the blanks, or this sort of micro task of retrieving something from memory, you're not really developing that creativity aspect of language use. And so there's a big gap between like that sort of Duolingo lesson sort of framework of just retrieving something from memory and getting a micro reward, going from there to like, I don't know, writing an essay in that language where you have to sort of create new sentences that express a certain idea. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be like a sort of world-shattering new idea. It could just be like what I did last summer or something seemingly trivial. But just like taking some thoughts and formulating them in a coherent way into a paragraph is already like more creative, more sort of novelty inducing than just picking the right word to complete a sentence. And yeah, so it's interesting also that like Ruyer presents this sort of cybernetic pedagogy as kind of shifting the activity from the teacher to the student. On the one hand, of course, that's correct. The student is not just sort of passively listening to the teacher recite a lesson, but at the same time, the activity is sort of itself passive, in the sense that there's a very like what activity you're supposed to do at any given time is like preset. There's a correct answer to what is the missing word in the sentence, and all the student has to do is sort of retrieve that correct word from memory. And yeah, so this activity is kind of like already is determined by an external sort of command. The teacher or the designer of this course has already prepared, has sort of like decided what activity the student is supposed to learn, is supposed to perform in this learning process. Whereas something like writing, an account of your summer vacation, is already requires the student to like the teacher doesn't know in advance what the student is going to write, and even given a sort of knowledge of what the student did over the summer vacation, the teacher is not going to be able to sort of predict in advance what the student is going to write. So in this case, there's maybe more activity on the part of the teacher, in the sense that the teacher has to read the students' submissions and grade them and so on. But at the same time, the activity expected of the student is more, I guess, spontaneous or sort of internally directed, compared to this activity of the student in the sort of Duolingo model, where they're just kind of filling in the blanks or following a preset pattern of activity that the designer of the course has already set out. And it's also interesting in connection with like the sort of contemporary rollout of these AI tools, where of course probably the like biggest use case of these tools so far has been like students cheating on assignments. That like there's been several articles that have come out in various publications about how widespread the use of these tools is in sort of like high school, first year university, etc. That in many cases teachers have said they had to like basically shift their whole sort of teaching model to like in class sort of productions that you give some sort of like the students are supposed to write an essay in class, for example, as opposed to like giving them an assignment and having them come back next week and submit an essay. And yeah, so in this case, there's like has to be a shift of the teaching method to this more sort of real time production, as opposed to allowing the students to sort of work on their own time. And I think one sort of effect of this is that something like an essay, in the pre-ChatGPT world, requires a student to maybe think about something over the course of a week or several weeks or whatever, and take time to formulate an argument that makes sense and is persuasive and so on. Whereas, of course, if you're assigning the students are supposed to write something over the course of a class, an hour and a half or 3 hours or whatever, you can't the student can't sort of think about something in as much depth and read different sources and evaluate different arguments and so on. They have to sort of like produce a response immediately, so it kind of limits how much creativity the student or how much thinking the student can really do in that time frame. And so you're kind of back to this sort of pre-programmed response kind of framework, even if there's obviously more creativity than just filling in the blanks in a Duolingo exercise. You're still like the type of essay you're going to be able to write in a 3-hour class is like probably just going to be something like your existing opinions about a topic or something. You're not going to be able to sort of rethink what your position is on a topic and evaluate different sources and like do sort of more creative thinking. You're just sort of like reproducing your existing opinion in maybe somewhat different words. So yeah, it has a real, I think, sort of like limiting effect on like how much sort of self transformation you can undergo in this learning process.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard about the essay requirement. That makes sense. I've also heard that, as you mentioned, lots of students have been using ChatGPT to just kind of do their essays. At the end of this section, where Ruyer sort of says that while the cybernetic pedagogy approach is useful in certain circumstances, eventually, in educating a human being to do something, you need to give them these more open-ended assignments, the completion of what he calls œuvrette. And I think maybe in the next section he talks about learning to learn as something that machines can't really do. And maybe this, even though there's still, if a teacher gives students the task of writing an essay about their summer vacation, there's still a kind of prompt, I guess, in that situation, but it's sort of somewhere between the cybernetic learning scenario where there's a sort of definite right answer, which is maybe the kind of task that an LLM excel on, and the more open-ended task is something that the LLM might have more difficulty with. And then, at least in the case of like job training, the sort of limited responsibility scenario is likely to be followed by sort of being given kind of full responsibility for some task and having to figure out for yourself how everything is supposed to be organized and come together in that task, which is something that maybe the LLM is still completely.
Yeah, like if you think of maybe a sort of like traditional apprenticeship model of learning, you think about like Renaissance painters, for example, like so like one of these painters, Michelangelo or Da Vinci or whatever, like they're like Da Vinci wasn't just sort of one person. It was Da Vinci was sort of the name of this workshop where like you'd have these like apprentices, like you'd start out just sort of grinding paints to produce or grinding the pigments to produce paints. And then, maybe after a while, if you show that you are responsible enough to move to the next level, you sort of work on the painting the backgrounds of the painting. And then someone else takes over and does the portrait of the person in front, etc. And then so you get like more and more complicated, more and more creative elements of the task as you sort of master one level of that task. And there are of course many sort of skilled trades today that still use a sort of apprenticeship model where you might do some training in a classroom, you might learn some sort of theoretical elements of the trade, and then you're also working in the actual workplace where you start with like this low responsibility, low sort of creativity element of the task, doing some sort of prep work or something like that, and then as you sort of master different steps and you show that you are capable of exercising a certain amount of decision making in a responsible way, then you get more responsibility, more sort of open-ended problem solving, etc. Um, and the thing, like the example of the sort of summer vacation description task, this is something like if you were to ask ChatGPT, write me an account of a student's summer vacation, in Spanish or whatever, like ChatGPT could write a plausible answer to that pretty easily. Like that's something that is quite effective at, and partly this is because like this task, I mean, like the average student's account of their summer vacation is not going to be that interesting or creative. Vacations are going to be quite similar, and how they express it is going to be quite similar, etc. So this is sort of like the task of like producing an average sort of text with that's more or less coherent is something that these LLMs are quite good at. But if you were just to do something like say a creative nonfiction course where you're sort of like producing a piece of writing that expresses something new and interesting about a certain type of experience, and what we can learn about it, about our society or the human condition or whatever. This is something you're not going to get this kind of insight from a tool that is essentially just producing like an average of out of taking all these different texts that it's sort of churned through. So in this case, you have this like more creativity. Someone, if you were to do a sort of an apprenticeship model of writing, you might start with something like what I did on my summer vacation, this sort of like minimal creativity, and then sort of move to the sort of more ambitious topics where you have to figure out more for yourself about like what exactly you're trying to do. And then of course as you become say like a writer, in sort of the full sense of the term, you're not just sort of taking these prompts that someone is giving you, but you're thinking about the world, about your experience, about things you've read, etc., and then deciding for yourself what it is you're going to write. You're sort of finding a topic and developing that topic for yourself. And presumably, if you're sort of recognized as a writer, you've done so in a way that adds to our understanding of that topic. Says something new that people haven't said before. Presents a new side of the problem, etc. So yeah, you're sort of progressing as a writer in your capacity to develop something new, to sort of formulate an idea that hasn't been formulated before, etc. And this is quite different from just sort of like churning through millions of books and like preparing a text that sort of like is a kind of middle ground of all these different texts that sort of matches a prompt. So yeah, it's yeah, and so I think there's a big danger that like this kind of prevalence of these tools makes it much harder to sort of go through that trajectory of apprenticeship and increasing problem solving ability, increasing open-endedness, etc. Like if your only experience of writing that you can do in your sort of training period as a student is like this sort of exercise of writing an assignment in the classroom because the teacher can't assign something longer term, given the likelihood that students will just use ChatGPT to do the assignment. If that's your only experience of writing, then you probably are not going to get to a point where you're sort of looking at the world and evaluating your experiences and so on, and finding some new topic to develop for yourself, or some new aspect of a topic that hasn't been explored before, etc. So yeah, this sort of like gradual development of capacities to solve more and more open-ended problems, I think, is likely to or is going to be harder to sort of develop over time. And this is not just the case in writing. I think there's been in many fields, this in sort of like creative in the broad sense fields, where like there was until recently this sort of trajectory where you'd start with like this very sort of low level work that it doesn't involve a lot of responsibility, and you're not really solving these sort of broad open-ended problems, and then you sort of gradually progress to more and more open-ended problems, more responsibility, more creativity. But then, now with these AI tools, a lot of that sort of entry-level work has been eliminated. And so there's sort of a gap between there's that path from like I'm interested in this field, I want to work in this field, to becoming sort of the master of that field that is capable of solving open-ended problems and defining new ways of working in this area, etc. That path seems to have like a big gap in it now. So yeah, it is. I don't know. I guess we'll have to see how things develop over time, but yeah, it's hard to see where people are going to be able to get that experience and learn and develop that capacity to solve problems in an open-ended way. Okay, yeah, we can go on to the next bit. Yeah.
Okay, I can read the next section. Subsection is titled Learning. In theoretical terms, the most important point to grasp about cybernetic pedagogy is the difference between the reception of occasional functional information, which guides or shifts behavior, and the reception of structuring information, which is not meant to modify the immediate behavior of the receiver, but to modify the receiver himself by becoming knowledge with it. One can listen to a phrase in English, 1, in order to obey and respond to it, or 2, in order to learn English. Through a desired vicious circle, analogous to the process, quote, suppose the problem is resolved, unquote, the user of cybernetic pedagogy waits for the learner, by invention or chance, to respond to the occasional information as if he already possessed corresponding code or internal setup. The experiment indeed demonstrates that it is a quick means of learning. When the learning is successful, the learner is no longer distinguishable from an organism reacting that is according to its nature, as we understand it, according to its spatial structure, or its spatial structure combined with some transspatial elements on the occasion of information to be used to meet. One speaks one's maternal language, which is nevertheless, one responds to a phrase with a phrase without needing to, quote, consult one's memory or one's grammar. Quote unquote, integrated knowledge is not an internal source of information, quote, observable or consultable like a dictionary. Knowledge is, quote, participative. If they are to remain within the mechanistic framework, the cybernetic theories of learning must then explain how a flux of information received by machine M can become a new structure in the transformed M. They must explain how a feedback or programmed machine in the succession information received and according to the results obtained not only respond according to its assembly or program, but modify. Thus, the modified versions of IBM 704 and 709 have, to use Wiener's expression, a second-order program, higher program. They are programmed to modify themselves in their basic in a certain manner, which depends on the results obtained the first time. MIT's chess-playing machine first has only the mechanism, organ, that allow it to place one piece on the chessboard, a temporary memory, a permanent memory, some information combiners, and some transmission mechanism. When it moves a piece, the movement is recorded in its temporary memory. If it doesn't conform to the rules of the game, a human quote-unquote partner signals to the machine with the touch, and the machine transfers the quote-unquote memory of the made to its permanent, accompanied by the indication, quote-unquote, not allowed. Then it will compare the initially decided movement, the disallowed movements before act, and act accordingly. It then learns the code of the action. It puts it in its structure without this mode having been pre-programmed in advance. In the same way, it learns not only the moves that are allowed, but ones that are. This certainly appears to be a model conforming to learn, not a simple quote simulation. The double memory, temporary, and for example, very probably has some real correspondences. Gray Walter has already used the double memory installation of simulation conditioning added to his atomic, transforms it into a machina docilis, a temporal overlapping of stimulus 1 with stimulus 2, recorded and stored by memory 2, and preserved in the form of low frequency oscillation. In the chess-playing machine, it is the machine that plays the role of the active student. The human partner only plays the role of the teacher supervising the student's assimilation of the teaching. Theoretically, the person could be replaced by another machine, 2, which has been quote-unquote taught, in which communicates its integrated quote-unquote knowledge to the first machine, 1. On closer inspection, doubts arise. Machine 1 only appears to be. Its attempts are corrected from outside. The correct behavior is instilled in it progressively, instead of being inscribed in its structure. That's the key difference to a machine that doesn't learn. It is only capable of learning in a way externally quote-unquote forced, whereas a child, quote, can deduce from what he has grasped from the external learning which is surrounding subject him, its rule of conduct in the face of a new situation. He learns to learn. He practices self-learning. The analysis of the game of chess simplified to 9 squares, Martin Gardner's hexapod, where the moves are represented by the choice of a quote-unquote matchbox for a situation, and where the automaton, according to its very structure, would become unbeatable and lost 11 games, has demonstrated that it would be impossible to make it could play real chess according to the same principle. This is because it would necessitate more matchboxes than there are atoms in the Milky Way, and a time just as astronomical to calculate the valid combinations. Moreover, it wouldn't even play chess, properly speaking. The outcome of the game would be entirely predetermined, since every decision capable of leading the opponent of the automaton to victory would be disallowed from the outset. A true model of learning that would not be reduced to a simple machina labyrinthia with a rapidly gigantic number of combinations would involve much more challenging implementations. Notably, it would require models for the perception of forms, for recognition and the establishment of categories for analogous forms, as well as the development of a quote-unquote vocabulary corresponding to these categories and a syntax of use. As Michael Scriven remarks, it is a lot more difficult to create a controlled imprecision than a controlled precision, whereas the reverse is true for human beings. Some of this would need to be updated for the advent of game-playing artificial intelligences, like what is it, Deep Blue, the chess-playing computer, and the AlphaGo, I think, the Go computer that beat some World Go champion some years ago now. But I don't think that necessarily means that his point about matchboxes here is irrelevant. It's not that the chess-playing computer is capable of computing every possible outcome for every possible chess game necessarily. It's that it can see ahead from the given configuration of a chessboard more moves in advance and more permutations than many even expert human chess players. I'm not sure about the point about controlled imprecision being necessarily more difficult for machines now. Controlled imprecision, in a way, seems like a good way to describe the product of like ChatGPT. But I'm not sure. The point you made about ChatGPT being better at coding than other kind of modes of text composition, I guess, because coding is more rule governed, maybe suggests that it is still not as good at controlled imprecision in something like creating a poem, for instance. The sort of creative output I have seen from LLMs is not always very impressive.
Yeah, this bit is especially interesting. This section that we just read is especially interesting, given that pretty much all of the AI tools that have become prevalent now are specifically machine learning tools, as opposed to some of the earlier approaches to AI, where the idea was that the developers of the system would essentially program in all the knowledge like by hand that was required to perform this kind of task. Like you would one of the big problems that arose with this type of AI system was what was called the framing problem, which is especially interesting given the concepts of framing in this book. But yeah, so the question is like you give like a very simple story about like a kid's birthday party. I think I might have mentioned this before, but yeah, like a kid's birthday party. And then if you sort of like ask the system, like, does the cake explode at the end of the story? Does the chair levitate into the air or whatever? Like, if you don't tell the system in advance that chairs don't levitate, cakes don't normally explode, etc., like it has no way of sort of knowing what the answer to these like absurd questions would be. So the like if you just take in like a sort of normal like human written story about a kid's birthday party, it won't like specify that the chairs didn't levitate. because this is just something that we, in our sort of like folk physics knowledge of like how chairs behave, like we just sort of already understand that chairs don't spontaneously start to levitate. But of course, if you don't tell the computer that chairs don't levitate, it has no way of knowing that. But as you try to like build in all the background knowledge that the computer needs to like understand the story, like each like piece of knowledge already sort of presupposes like 1,000 other pieces of knowledge, like I don't know, what a physical object consists of, like what it means for a chair to be made of wood, for example, or you know the fact that all the parts of the chair are rigidly attached to each other and the chair will move as a whole. All these sort of like basic sort of um, aspects of the world that we're familiar with just as a result of interacting with chairs and so on. All these things like have to be sort of built in manually, and as you try to like add in all that background knowledge by hand, you like it just ends up becoming such a like the amount of like statements you have to like teach the computer or program in to the computer just sort of grows in such an astronomical at such an astronomical rate that it's like impossible to even get it to understand like a very basic story, yeah, about like a kid's birthday party. Yeah, or maybe maybe it just like thought the story about the kid's birthday party was boring, and then so it decided that maybe the chairs do levitate and maybe the birthday cake does explode. Um, uh, but yeah, and then so the example of the chess playing game. So yeah, like chess is like a very sort of structured universe for a computer. Like each piece has a limited set of moves it can make, and then given the arrangement of pieces on the board, that further limits the types of moves that are possible. But even there, because each piece has a certain number of moves, and then given like each of these pieces at each turn can you can move any of the other pieces. Many of these moves don't make any sense from a strategic perspective, but are still legal moves. So like each turn in the game, like you have a certain number of moves, and so like the number of possible games is like the number of possible moves in step one times the number of possible moves in step two, etc. And so it grows very quickly, and then you get to the point of like there are more possible games of chess than there are atoms in the universe, and so clearly you can't create a chess playing computer by just sort of brute force searching through every possible set of moves that can be that follow from a certain board position and then selecting one that leads to victory. So if you're going to have a computer that is capable of playing chess, like as developed in the 1990s and in the Deep Blue computer from IBM, you have to like the computer has to incorporate some kind of domain specific knowledge about chess. It has to be able to not just brute force search through every possible game given a certain board position, but it has to have some way of taking in information about the board position and selecting like a strategic direction without sort of guaranteed success based on like the brute force search. It has to be able to say like to look at a given board position and say moving this piece improves the chance of success, and whereas moving this other piece reduces the chance of success, and therefore the first move is better. And this obviously like a human is not sort of brute force searching through every possible set of moves, but is instead looking at the board and sort of understanding the strategic arrangement of the pieces, that like this piece is threatening this other piece, or if I make this move, then my opponent will do this or could do this, and that would endanger this other piece, etc. So you're sort of analyzing the board in terms of strategic value of different pieces and what their relationship to other pieces is, and you're making a decision that sort of as far as you can tell will improve your strategic position, or hopefully lead towards victory, make you closer to victory. But you can't from the outset just sort of define a path through all the possible moves that will guarantee your victory. And this is already like chess is already like a pretty simple game in the sense of a limited board, a limited set of pieces, which each have limited possible moves. And then if you sort of expand this into like a more sort of open-ended situation, a real-world situation where you have like a robot navigating through a real landscape, you can already see that it's going to be much more difficult to navigate in the sense that you can't just sort of build in like if you see a stick in front of you at this many centimeters at this angle, etc., then make this action. Like you can't just sort of define rules for every single possible circumstance that this robot might encounter. Um, you have to have some sort of domain specific knowledge of like what kinds of obstacles the robot might encounter, and like a general sort of procedure for dealing with these kinds of situations that has to be sort of applied to specific situations. So you have to have some way of getting the robot to take this sort of general characterization of like a situation and apply it to this specific situation. Um, and so one of the sort of, or probably the sort of general way of solving this kind of problem is by allowing the robot to learn, or the computer that's controlling the robot to learn. So something like even the more recent sort of limited success with like bipedal robots has generally involved some kind of machine learning process. So it's not that the researchers are like programming the robot. This is how you move your legs to, for bipedal locomotion that is, stable across different surfaces and, different, angles of the surface, etc. It's the robot is actually, well, usually they use a simulation first because you don't want to have your like poorly trained computer controlling an expensive robot at first. So you use a simulation first to get it to sort of moderately good stability of controlling this sort of virtual robot, and then you allow it to control the real robot and train it on a variety of different surfaces, different gaits like walking versus running, and then it just sort of adapts over time. It sort of learns how to control the limbs in such a way that it won't fall down, for example. So yeah, in this case, the researchers themselves won't even necessarily, or in general, won't know what it is exactly that the computer is doing to ensure that the robot doesn't fall down. Like the learning process produces a result which is not generally possible to understand just by sort of looking at the weights in a neural network, for example. You can't just sort of look at it and go, okay, this is what the computer is doing. It takes actually pretty difficult analysis to figure out, what exactly, how the computer is controlling the limbs of this robot to ensure that it stays stable. Yeah, and then maybe one other point I'd mention here is that one of the sort of like in the case of this robot training example, it would generally use the technique called reinforcement learning, where you have some sort of reward or penalty function applied to different to some sort of event. So in the case of the robot simulate, like in the simulation stage, for example, you would have like a simulated robot body, and then you would give like some sort of penalty every time the robot body falls down, and then you would train the machine learning system to minimize that penalty. So the less often it falls down, the less penalty it gets, and so it sort of gradually reduces that falling down penalty. And this is sort of the same type of process as the like I don't know. You can think of a child learning to play chess. If the child uses a certain strategy and then loses, they're probably going to learn, okay, this strategy is not very effective, and then try a different strategy. So here you have like the sort of penalty of losing the game, and I believe the AlphaGo system that you mentioned also used reinforcement learning, where so they like trained it on different existing like recorded Go games and tried to get it to to play, and then have it trained in such a way that it would either win or lose depending on what strategies it pursued, and then it sort of learned what is an effective strategy just by winning or losing a game. So here, like this system ended up being better at playing Go than any human. So the humans who designed it clearly were not sort of telling it this is how you play Go at a high level. They were designing it to learn how to play Go, and it was actually capable of learning better Go playing strategies than the designers or any other human had ever developed. So yeah, in this case, the capacity for a machine to have better than human performance on this specific task required that the machine be capable of learning. This is obviously a very sort of simple task. Like even Go is more open ended than chess, but it's still it's just a matter of placing a token on a grid. It's a very sort of restricted set of actions you can take. But yeah, as you mentioned, the Go playing computer is not going to be capable of generating an image for you, or writing a poem, or solving an equation, or whatever. Like these are sort of domain specific learning systems, and it seems like the more effective AI tools are actually the ones that are domain specific, rather than like ChatGPT is supposed to be this general purpose tool, and it does like a lot of things sort of at a mediocre level, plus some hallucinations that are potentially quite dangerous, depending on what domain you're trying to apply it to. Yeah, and so like the ones that the systems that have had like a lot of success and sometimes better than human level performance have been the ones that are sort of dedicated to a specific task. Whereas the sort of general purpose ones tend to just sort of be kind of mediocre, plus some like extreme failures that like no human would ever, or it would be very surprising to see from a human. And the learning piece is also quite interesting from a sort of a philosophical perspective as well, because like when you think of like this is something that Wittgenstein sort of repeatedly points to, about like how when you're sort of teaching a person, like so many of his sort of vignettes in his texts are like learning situations where you have like the teacher and the student, but a lot of the teaching that happens in these little vignettes is not sort of the teacher giving the student like a sort of exhaustive set of rules for how to handle a situation. And that's sort of the point, is that like even something as simple as like counting by two, you can give the student a rule, but the student has to sort of catch on to how they're supposed to use that rule. You can't just give like you can't give an exhaustive set of rules that completely determines the how the student is supposed to apply the rules. Like each rule give a meta rule of how to apply the first rule, etc. Like clearly this is not how humans learn. At some point the student has to just sort of see what the teacher is doing and sort of grasp the explanation that the teacher gives, and then be able to apply that rule to a novel situation. And yeah, so partly the learning process is not just, so sometimes the teacher does give like a rule, an explanation of like here's how to handle this type of situation, but clearly you can't like learning that it just consists of presenting a sequence of rules is not really what we would call learning in sort of the stronger sense of the word. Because if the student is only capable of like regurgitating the rules that they've learned but is not capable of applying them, then we would say like, okay, you've learned a bunch of rules for how to play chess, but you are actually not good at playing chess. Yeah, so being able to take these like sort of tips about chess strategy and then apply them to a real chess game is quite different than taking these statements about here's a good way of playing chess and then being able to reproduce those statements. And yeah, so like the sort of mastery of a skill that a human exhibits is also, it also involves this kind of mysterious capacity to like sort of grasp the point of something, or grasp how to apply a rule in new situations that weren't presented before. And yeah, so to the extent that these AI tools are capable of exhibiting sort of interesting performance, or in some cases better than human performance, it's because they are capable of taking some sort of pattern or rule that they've learned from existing examples and applying it to new situations. So like if an AI tool is only capable of reproducing what it's already seen, then it's not really very helpful. Actually, there's a funny sort of like parody paper where the authors say that they've invented this like amazing AI system that can learn to have this great performance by just on these sort of benchmark tests by just giving the benchmark uh, training set as its training data. So yeah, if you just train the AI on the data you're going to test it on, then it's capable of learning at a such a fast rate. It's much better than all these like existing AI algorithms, etc. So yeah, if all you're doing is getting the AI to reproduce the answers that you've already given it, then yeah, you can have the amazing performance with like a very minimal training set. But if you want your AI to be able to do something useful on new data that it hasn't seen before, then obviously it's much harder to get the system to do that. The same as with a human, like getting the human to memorize the conjugation of a verb is not so complicated, but getting the human to be able to use that verb in a sentence is much more difficult. Okay, so yeah, I think we can probably stop here for today. But yeah, so this chapter is proving to be quite interesting in relation to contemporary problems. I think that there's probably a big difference between 1950s technology and 1960s technology in terms of like how applicable it is to contemporary questions or the types of problems that were being analyzed in the 1960s are probably more relevant to the types of problems that are facing this type of technology today. But yeah, so we can stop here and continue. I think this chapter is fairly long, so we'll have a few more weeks. But yeah, we'll pick up from there next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Non. Thanks, 61. See you next